With God, there is always more. More love, more life, more freedom. Welcome to Zoweh's Exploring More with Michael Thompson. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Our Heavenly Father has provided many delightful inns for us along our journey, but He takes great care to see that we do not mistake any of them for home." Join me and the team as we explore the kingdom together, discovering the deep truths and offering encouragement for the journey. There is always more. Hi, welcome to the Exploring More podcast. I'm Michael Thompson. I'm so glad to be here with my friends SJ and one of our good friends, board members, and partners in ministry over the last several years, Gary Barkalow. He's played a significant role in my journey and SJ's in our teams. And so, man, Gary, it's so good to have you sitting in on an Exploring More podcast series.
Yeah, thank you. It's really good being here. And right, we're brothers in arms and brothers in the Lord, and this is good doing this together.
Yeah. And so Gary's been in town for some time with us and time with our team. And of course, we wanted to sit down and explore some more of the kingdom with him. And he's been quite a father figure, big brother figure to many of us. And I wanted this particular podcast series is going to be a 3-part series on the journey of the heart. And Gary was very significant in not only our lives, our team's life, our ministry's establishment, but also in the lives of hundreds and thousands of other men. And so it's an honor to be here. This idea of a journey of the heart. I remember when The Sacred Romance, the book, The Sacred Romance came out in 1997, and it had a profound impact on me. And yet I'm not sure I understood as much of it the first time around as I possibly could even today. It's much more clear to me. But the author of The Sacred Romance, Brent Curtis, with the help of John Eldredge, you've known both of those men. And Brent Curtis particularly was somebody who had a significant role in your journey of your heart. Could you talk about Brent just a little bit?
Yeah. So I met Brent back in the early days as he was actually writing The Sacred Romance. I'd heard of him. He was actually teaching a course just for anyone to come in on counseling. In my understanding, just in counseling and understanding people, I'm sure he would have said on the heart. And so I'd heard of him. I actually had him come in and speak several times to my staff team when I was with Athletes in Action. And I was very taken by him. But when he really got to me there was a time when my wife, Lee, came to me and said, "I'd really like to see Brent as a counselor." Now, at this time also, we were in a small group with he and his wife, Ginny. But she said, "I really want to see him as a counselor." And so she went in, had a number of sessions with him. She just wanted to sort some things out in her heart that, frankly, I didn't even understand what those were and what to do with them. And at a certain point, Brent told Lee, "I want Gary to come in." And I really was convinced it was to help me reinforce to Lee what he was trying to communicate to her.
So you thought you were coming in for support of Brent's positions with Lee and the journey she's on.
Yes.
Okay.
To be a second voice, to lend evidence to what he was saying.
I can tell where this is going, man.
Yeah. So when I got in the office, and again, Brent and I knew each other, so we didn't have to go through the niceties of introductions and names and that kind of thing. And he didn't ask me anything about Lee. He launched in immediately into my story. And I really didn't understand what my story had to do with any of this, with Lee, or even me at this point. But he launched into my story, and I was just kind of telling my story matter-of-factly as an autobiography. And I got to a certain part in my life, and he just stopped me, and he looked at me, and he had these eyes. It was unbelievable. He had kind eyes, but he had eyes that saw through you. So you were both so excited to be with him. You wanted to be with him, but you were so afraid of him at the same time because you knew he saw something all the time. And so he stopped me and he just said, "Gary, that situation, your relationship to your mother is the saddest thing I've ever heard." And I broke into tears.
Wow.
Uncontrollably. I mean, I didn't see it coming. I didn't even understand why I was crying at that moment.
Yeah, no one had ever said that to you before, I'm sure, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I talked about it with no effect.
Right.
And there was something about the way he said it, and then he saw something and took me to tears. And that was the beginning of his introducing me to my heart. I couldn't have told you back then what the heart was or what it meant, but that He was just that kind of man. He was just kind, but he was very knowing. And so he was a huge influence in my life from before, but definitely from that point on.
So that was prior to the publishing of the Sacred Romance.
Right.
But you heard him talking about these elements and these ingredients, these themes of a sacred romance. Like what year was this? In the mid-90s? Earlier than that?
Yeah, probably mid-90s or early 90s. Yeah, I would guess. And what he and John did was, before they published the book, and as they were turning in the manuscript, not the final one, they actually did a series on the sacred romance, right, in Colorado Springs at Glen Eyrie, and they were just talking through it because they wanted to watch the reactions of people, and they wanted to hear each other as well, co-authoring this, doing every other chapter or so. So it was amazing hearing this all brought together, and then just having Brent speak, into my life personally. It was a decisive moment in my life.
Just the description of Brent reminds me, SJ, my reaction to that is took me right to like a very skilled surgeon, like an orthopedic. So you think you're going there into the office with your wife,
right,
to be support for her during this time, and he says, "Why don't you sit down for a minute?
Take a seat in the chair." Yeah.
Does it hurt here?
Right. Right.
And then he provokes this reaction, like, "Yeah, that's where it hurts."
Yep.
And you want to go, can we do something about that? I heard the words, kind, these eyes that were kind but could see right through you. I think that's a great definition. If I was going to make a definition today for what does dangerous for good look like? Kind but can see.
C.S. Lewis talking about Aslan, and Susan is looking at, I think it's Susan, is looking at the lion and asks the beavers, is he safe? Is he safe? Mm-hmm. No, but he's good. And I just picture his face and those kind of eyes where it's sort of so kind, so loving, but can see right into your heart.
Yeah.
I mean, would that be accurate description?
I mean, when we would just say hello to each other. We were in a small group. And within a second, just him looking in my eyes with his eyes and saying something and hearing his voice, I just immediately wanted to say, can I tell you how hard my life has been? I don't know what to do with this. So, he was quite a man. And in those days, I think, I would have understood the word sacred, but I wouldn't have understood the word journey with sacred. And that was a changing point, a sacred journey. And the whole intimate side to a walk with God was pretty foreign to me in those days.
Me too. Yeah.
And I wasn't scolded for not understanding. I was invited in and walked with into that.
Yeah, which I think is a great definition some clarity, Gary, when you say that. When I first read the Sacred Romance, I think that's what was true. I didn't have categories for some of this. I knew a lot about God, but I couldn't say that we had an intimate walk and relationship that I knew he heard my voice, but I hadn't really heard his voice. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea of romance, obviously that jumps for men particularly, and not just men, but into a category of romance novels, Harlequin, the idea of a romance. But I'm so glad that I stepped into that book. I'm so glad I stepped into his teaching through that book, and how it began to take my walk, my journey of the heart with God to just very, very, very significant and glorious places. Yeah.
And just a little bit more of that story I told being in his office. Again, I was taken by whatever was happening in my heart at that moment with that question. I didn't know what to do with the emotions of it. I didn't know if this was profound or not. I didn't know what Brent was seeing about this. And I remember I came back in his office the following week, and before I had gone back in that week's time, I had done a lot of journaling, and then asking God, what is this about? Is this important? Why is it important? What do I do with this? And so I came back in his office the following week, and I said, Brent, that was really good. And I tell you, I've been spending time with God, and I know what God is up to in this. I know what this is about. And I said a few things. I don't even know what it was, but he kindly listened to me for a few minutes. And then he finally said, Gary, he said, you have only gotten on the street. You're not at the end of this one. Just let it go. You're striving to understand what is God up to and what does this mean about who God is and who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. Just let it go. Mm-hmm. There are deeper things to be understood. And And again, that was that disruptive, provoking, there is more for you.
Yeah.
Let me lead you into it. There are things you haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I'm sitting here hearing you say that, and I know that you have brought that truth to my life and to many others. I mean, to hear that Brent impacted you with that you're just stepping on. I mean, what is it about us that we want to solve the problem pretty quickly?
Yeah,
we want to get through it. You hear it all the time. Oh, I've worked through that.
Right.
I've got to the end of this. Thanks for your help. I've
figured this out.
I've made some notes, and I see where you're going with this. As if we could jump to the end of.
Yeah, it's interesting. You both said, that you understood the word sacred, and obviously you understood the word journey, but you never would have paired the two of those together. You didn't understand or didn't perceive your relationship with God and your own heart as a sacred journey. It was just sacred. It's a static thing. We're not, we do the right things and we say the right things and we, receive our salvation every other Sunday for the things we did, and it's not really a journey. I think for me, I understood journey. I understood that I was really living this journey of life, but there was nothing sacred about it other than my own desires and wants and needs. I was the center of my own story. And so it was falsely sacred. It was sacred to me, but nobody else, and had nothing to do with God.
Yeah, that's good, SJ. That's good. We're just talking about words, terms, and somebody introduces them to you, and then they become part of you over time. They become more and more true. I was thinking about this. I was looking at a book just the other day that was written by a 30-year-old. Nothing wrong with a book written by a 30-year-old. There's really nothing wrong with that. But a book about your journey with God by a 30-year-old as opposed to a 60-year-old or a 50-year-old. I mean, and it's not that it's not true when the 30-year-old writes it, but how much more true is it to the 50-year-old or 60-year-old? Mm-hmm. That something about the journey, something about the mystery of that, not solving your life, but rather walking with God in this sacred romance, on this sacred journey, it's important. I mean, the older I get, I guess maybe that's part of it, that I look back and go, what did I know at 30? What did I know at 40? I'm 53. What did I know last year? This year, what am I learning? Where's God taking me? The part that I like about, and why it's hard, I think, to toggle between the sacred journey, the sacred romance, is, journey sounds like something you can accomplish. Sounds like you can make headway.
There's mile markers.
There's an odometer to a journey.
Yeah.
A romance is this invitation to a depth. A romance is this invitation to what we would say about intimacy, knowing and being known. I'm better at the odometer stuff, right? I think as a man.
Yeah. Yep. It's not better for you, though.
Right.
I think just to kind of echo and expound upon what you said a little bit, the journey is very linear. It's easier to mark it off. There's a destination in mind, so there's a light at the end of the tunnel, whatever that might mean. With romance, I mean, this in the context of marriage. You don't get to just romance your wife until she marries you, and then the romance is over. It doesn't work that way. And if you've lived that way, exactly, listeners, what I'm saying. Because your wife is not going to buy into that, not for very long anyway. She wants to be continually romanced. Mm-hmm. And at the root of it, in our heart of hearts, in our truest selves, we want to be continually romanced as well. Men do. And we receive that from Jesus. And if we're married to a woman who's alert and oriented, who sees that, then she gets that too.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about love, romance, intimacy. And I think Brent, in his book, The Sacred Romance, just, again, it was kind of stunning. Like, I'm not sure I've ever heard it like this. And yet, in his book is John 3:16. In his book is God loves you. In his book is God is love. I mean, there's some similar ingredients, but I never had it mixed, together like that. Could you talk about just God's love, Brent, his experience, and maybe we can talk about the significance of living in a romance with God?
Yeah. Let me just say, to start with this comment, Brent did not have an easy life. He had a very hard life for a number of reasons, just the different aspects of his life. And so this wasn't a man who everything was just going great and it was easy and he could talk about romance, and that wasn't his life. But he was a man who, as he was very open and transparent about the things that he was working through, struggling through, wondering about, what he always looked for was the love of God through that. What is God up to in this? How is he loving me? How is he freeing me? How is he bringing me something better that I'm currently experiencing? He was always looking for that, which was remarkable. Just the way he looked at God, he understood the gospel and what did it mean. And then how do we live with each other? Because that was the other thing. I experienced him as a man who could ask me hard questions and bring up maybe painful things and good things, joyful things, but he could bring up those things, and I knew he was after my heart doing better, my life doing better, my pursuit of God. And he was convinced that God was doing the same with him and us. So the other thing is he also knew, and I think he saw it very much in me, that my heart was fairly closed down, except in the areas of duty, obligation, mission, and tasks. I was very dialed into, as far as I thought, what was the gospel about? What was God's work in this world about? And I'm about that business. And he was trying to bring me out of the realm, or to bring into the realm of business, was relationship and heart and passion and desire. And of course, you go there, you have to also go into pain and longing and disappointment. So he was very much about opening up the heart, knowing that would bring more of the life of God into our own life.
Well, it's a great place. Let's take a break. It's a great place to stop. And then I want to bring up a couple quotes from the Sacred Romance. So we'll be right back with the Exploring More podcast on the Journey of the Heart, Part 1. Hey, do you love audiobooks? If you're listening to the Exploring More podcast, then you might love the new Heart of Aware audiobook. Becoming a beloved son and entering into the healing and training God is offering His warrior men is a wonderful and critical journey, and now it's available on audio. You can find it on our website as CDs or a downloadable MP3 and start your audio version of The Heart of a Warrior right away. For our friends and allies who are on Audible and all the other audiobook platforms, look for The Heart of a Warrior. Start your orientation today. Become a man who knows who he is, where he is, and the good that God is up to in his life through the Heart of a Warrior audiobook. Welcome back to Exploring More, and we are in part 1 of a series of the Journey of the Heart with our friend Gary Barkalow. And Gary, just before the break, I was kind of sitting here waiting to share the next part from Brent Curtis's The Sacred Romance, and you were talking. And it's stunning how God weaves and does things. And so let me read an excerpt here, especially as it pertains to what you just said. So he's talking about story. And again, I think the romance part is what Gary was talking about. It's not duties and chores and responsibilities. This is something else. Romance is about a story and about being caught up in one. So Brent writes, why story? The deepest convictions of our heart are formed by stories and reside there in the images and emotions of a story. Skipping ahead a few paragraphs, he says, something in my heart connected with this story. He was talking about a gospel, part of the gospel. Something in my heart connected with this story. So that's how you do it. You train under a great burden, and you will be so far beyond the rest of the world, you will be untouchable. It became a defining image for my life, formed in and from a story. Life is not a list of propositions. It is a series of dramatic scenes. And then he goes on and says, pretty famous quote from him, story is the language of the heart. How does that land in your heart?
Yeah, I think, again, going back to how I described that I was the center of the story and so was living in a very small story at one time, as many of us were. For the longest time, I didn't realize that anyone really wanted to know me, that anyone wanted to hear my story, that even my wife. I mean, we were in a pretty broken place for a lot of years. So I didn't understand, and I'm still working out, what that looks like, sharing my story, hearing other people's stories, listening to a man's story when he shares it, not so that I can counterpoint or how I can respond or fix him somehow, but just so that he knows I'm hearing him. This idea that our story, as you mentioned it from Brent, is central to the heart. It's just so foreign to me for so long. But it's so important, because without that understanding and that willingness to take a step into sharing yours or listening to someone else's, you're isolated. I mean, you are living on an island, and it's a pretty small one.
Yeah, I think of it in a silly way, in a funny way, in kind of an indicting way. We have a banter with each other as friends, and how many times does some of the situations that we're experiencing together, that we're going through, end in a line from a movie?
Oh, 99% of the time, probably.
A quote from, all kinds
comedians, that we love.
What Brent is saying in this particular section of the book and through the book is how it is the language of, you remember these scenes, these stories, and the thing. I can't remember, the scriptures I read this morning sometimes, though I'm very familiar, I think, with the scriptures, but, there's just certain things that trigger in my life story. And here comes a narrative, here comes an interpretation, here comes how common it was, how that line from a film, and to start to live and see, I think, in a narrative, in our lives as a narrative, and especially a love story. This is still at work in my life, 20 years plus, in being introduced to life with God as a romance. You see a couple, any couple, an older couple particularly, who are sitting together at dinner out, and you feel like you can kind of see a couple who's they're just eating.
Yeah, the phones may be out, and
maybe, but
not even looking at each other. Yeah.
And then you see a couple who maybe they're in their 70s or 80s, and they're sitting at dinner and they're on a date.
Right.
They're in a romance. They still are. He's talking to her. She's talking to him. They are sharing a dessert. It's just something.
Two straws, one milkshake,
yeah,
right?
Draws you, to the idea that, I want that. I hope Robin and I are that, in that season. So this romance, God loving us, pursuing us. How did that shift from maybe a different kind of gospel that we might have entered into the kingdom, and how did that change or be upgraded to a romance, a gospel that had a romance for you, Gary, in your journey?
So let me go back to that first time with Brent. So Brent is asking me questions about my story. I thought he was analyzing and evaluating me, but he was asking my story. And there were points where he wanted to stop and say, let's go back and expand the scene. There's more to this than you're telling me. And so what I was experiencing from him was a man who wanted to understand my story, to understand and love me well and care for me well. That's what I experienced. And he did, because he knew who I was. And that was one of the rare times in my life from then earlier that I felt like I was being understood, but not examined, not analyzed, but really understood for friendship, for love, and for care. And I think what he did in this whole thing too was he helped me understand that God tells his story in scriptures. And it's not simply, I'm going to teach you some lessons. If you do this, I will do this. See what I did to those people when they did that? And see how I react and see what makes me mad. It wasn't that. It was a story where God was saying, I want you to understand who I am, because you'll love me if you do. And then the sense of God saying, I do know your story and want to interact with it because I love you and I want to love you. I want to go deeper with you. So that whole story element changed so many things for me. And even understanding my life. I realized, gosh, I don't even understand who I am until I go back into my story, because I got here through a series of situations in my life, all those story points. So that was such a different thing for me to understand my life, understand my wife and other people. And understand the Gospels, understand Scriptures. It was a whole turn for me. It wasn't simply what makes God mad and what makes him happy and what I ought to be doing, but rather God saying, I want you to know me. You have to understand my story and my heart.
That's so good. I realize again and again that if the approach that I've taken to my life is getting things right, doing things right, then that's the approach I'm going to take with the lives of others.
Yeah.
And this is one of the gifts of the sacred romance and the journey of the heart, is that it's not just about getting it right. It's about doing it well. It's about understanding. It's about connecting with God. I mean, if I can do those things with God, then I'm much more apt to be able to do those things with others. And so to be invited into a romance versus the service of God, it's a very different story.
Right. And speaking of that, and you have seen this too, I've had so many people say to me in an honest moment, I think God loves me, but I don't think he likes me. I mean, I feel that, right? Which tells me, okay, there is a glitch in the romance side of this, right? He does love you, and not because you are his child and he has to. I think everybody relates to that, either being that child that you felt like your parents loved you, but they didn't really like you. They really liked the other kids. Or maybe feeling that with your own kids if a situation came up. But nonetheless, this element of romance is so key. We can't understand grace without it. We can't understand forgiveness. We can't understand loving someone else with it. We can't understand God without understanding that.
Yeah. This is a great setup for part 2 of the Journey of the Heart, where we're going to talk about the stories of our lives, the wounding stories, the wounding chapters, the things that have happened to us that do make it difficult, almost impossible to experience a romance, to open our hearts to that, versus tell me what to do and I'll do it. Tell me what to be and I'll be it. The performance kind of life. And so, yeah, this is a good place to kind of close out part 1 in the Journey of the Heart. And we'll be back next week with part 2, talking about getting your heart back. What does that mean? And where is it? And what happened to it? So you can help us on exploring more by stepping into your podcast platform and writing a remark, sharing it with somebody else. Love to get your comments. Let us know what you think. Let us know how these podcasts are landing. You can always reach out to us at support, SUPPORT, at Zoweh, ZOWEH.org. Support at Zoweh.org. We look forward to hearing from you and hope we do soon. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Exploring More. The landing page for this podcast is Zoweh.org/podcast. That's ZOWEH.org/podcast, where you can find the show notes and various platforms to which we broadcast. You can also find us and the life of more by visiting Zoweh on YouVersion Bible app, Right Now Media, our Facebook page, and Zoweh on Instagram and Twitter. Remember, with God there is always more, and you were made for more.